Good Thursday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for October the 12th. Today, we are finishing up the genealogical portion of our read through First Chronicles by looking at chapters 8 and 9. Chapter 8 is going to finish up with another retelling of Benjamin's descendants with a different focus, though, this time. We read about them in the previous chapter, chapter 7. Now we're going to look at them from a different angle. And then chapter 9 is going to tell us about those who returned first from exile, and specifically about those who were going to be serving in various ways as they resumed worship within the land of Israel. So let me get the text up on the screen for us. We'll read along together here in First Chronicles chapter 8 in verse number 1. First Chronicles chapter 8 verse number 1. I actually want to find a little, finally got one of my resources in. Took a little bit longer for Amazon to get it to me this time than usual. And I actually meant to, let's see here. I want to read this with you. So I thought this was really good just to help us get some insight into what we have here with these genealogies in Chronicles, First Chronicles chapters 1 through 9. It says here in verse, or not verse, this is from Martin Selman's Tyndale Old Testament commentaries on First Chronicles. I really appreciate what he said here in this portion. He said, these seemingly intractable problems are almost certainly the kind of issues that lists and genealogies, that the list and genealogies of First Chronicles 1 through 9 are intended to comfort or to confront. It says earlier about how the Jews felt their present state of affairs was God's will based upon punishment for their past sins, which I think we would agree that to be the case. But talking about these genealogies, he says they show that the chronicler's generation had not, after all, been cast off from their historical, geographical, and spiritual moorings. If they would only look back, look around, and look up, they would see that they still belonged to Israel and that their present predicament was not hopeless. So we're wondering, why? Why list these genealogies? Why list Benjamin's descendants again here in chapter 8? Why is it necessary to do this again? Well, it's to connect the present Israel to the past Israel, not connect them by means of their sin and the rebellion that had got them into captivity in the first place, but just to remind them that this is who they are, that they are the chosen people of God, and that they are back in the promised land, and they belong there. That is the land God wants them to have. And yet, because of their sin, they could not be allowed to remain there, lest they completely corrupt the land and bring it into total disrepair by the presence of continued sin and rebellion against God. So keep that in mind as we're going through these descendants. And I'm sorry I didn't have that earlier to read to kind of give us that framework through which to read these genealogies here in the first 9 chapters. But now that we've read that, let's start here in First Chronicles chapter 8 and verse number 1, where it tells us that Benjamin fathered Bela, his firstborn. Ashbel was born second, Ahara third, Noha fourth, and Rapha fifth. Bela's sons Adar, Gera, Abihud, Abishua, Naaman, Ahoa, Gera, Shephaphan, and Huram. These were Ehud's sons, who were the heads of the families living in Geba, and who were deported to Manahath. Naaman, Ahijah, and Gera. Gera deported them and was the father of Uzzah and Ahihud. Shapharim had sons in the territory of Moab after he had divorced his wives Hushim and Baara. His sons by his wife Hodesh, Jobab, Zibiah, Mesha, Malcham, Juz, Sakia, and Mirma. These were his sons, family heads. He also had sons by Hushim, Abitub, and El-Paal. El-Paal's sons, Aber, Misham, and Shemed, who built Ono and Lod and its surrounding villages, Beriah and Shema, who were the family heads of Ajalon's residents and who drove out the residents of Gath, Io, and Shashak, and Jeremoth. Zebediah, Arad, Ader, Mikael, Ishpa, and Joah were Beriah's sons. Zebediah, Meshulam, Hizki, Haber, Ishmerai, Isliah, and Jobab were El Paal's sons. Jakim, Zikri, Zabdi, Elianai, Zilithai, Eliel, Adiah, Beriah, and Shimroth were Shimei's sons. Ishpan, Aber, Eliel, Abdon, Zikri, Hanan, Hananiah, Elam, Anathijah, Iphidiah, and Pinuel were Shushak's sons. Shamsherai, Shehariah, Athaliah, Jaareshiah, Elijah, and Zikri were Jeroham's sons. These were family heads, chiefs according to their family records. They lived in Jerusalem. Jeiel fathered Gibeon and lived in Gibeon. His wife was Maacah. Abdon was his firstborn, then Zur, Kish, Baal, Nadab, Gader, Eo, Zecher, and Mikloth, who fathered Shemaiah. These also lived opposite their relatives in Jerusalem with their other relatives. Ner fathered Kish. Kish fathered Saul, and Saul fathered Jonathan, Malchishua, Abinadab, and Eshbaal. Jonathan's sons were Meribaal, and Meribaal fathered Micah. Micah's sons, Pithon, Melech, Tareah, and Ahaz. Ahaz fathered Jehoiada, maybe that's right, fathered Alemeth, Maveth, and Zimri fathered Moza. Moza fathered Benaiah. His son was Rapha, his son Elisah, and his son Azel. Azel had 6 sons, and these were their names: Azrikam, Bokeru, Ishmael, Sariah, Obadiah, and Hanan. All these were Azel's sons. His brother Eshek's sons: Ulam was his firstborn, Jush second, and Eliphelet third. Ulam's sons were valiant warriors and archers. They had many sons and grandsons, 150 of them. All these were among Benjamin's sons. All Israel was registered in the genealogies that were written in the book of the kings of Israel. But Judah was exiled to Babylon because of their unfaithfulness. The first to live in their towns on their own property again, so this is talking about the return from captivity, they were the Israelites, priests, Levites, and temple servants. These people from the descendants of Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh settled in Jerusalem. Uthai, son of Amihud, son of Omri, son of Imri, son of Bani, and a descendant of Perez, son of Judah. From the Shilonites, Isaiah, the firstborn, and his sons, and from the descendants of Zerah, Jeuel, and their relatives, 690 in all. The Benjaminites, Salu, son of Meshullam, son of Hodaviah, son of Hasinua, Ibneiah, son of Jeroham, Ella, son of Uzi, son of Mikri, Meshullam, son of Shephatiah, son of Reuel, son of Ibnijah, and their relatives, according to their family records, 956 in all. All these men were the heads of their ancestral families. The priests: Jediah, Jehoiarib, Jakin, Azariah, son of Hilkiah, son of Meshullam, son of Zadok, son of Merioth, son of Ahitub, and the chief official of God's temple. Adiah, son of Jeroham, son of Pashur, son of Malchijah, Maasai, son of Adiel, son of Jazerah, son of Meshullam, son of Meshilemith, there we go, son of Emer, and their relatives, the heads of their ancestral families, 1,760 in all. They were capable men employed in the ministry of God's temple. The Levites: Shemaiah, son of Hashub, son of Azikram, son of Hashabiah of the Merarites, Bakbakar, Heresh, Galal, and Mattaniah, son of Micah, son of Zikri, son of Asaph, Obadiah, son of Shemaiah, son of Galal, son of Jeduthun, and Berechiah, son of Asa, son of Elkanah, who lived in the settlements of the Netophathites. The gatekeepers, Shallum, Akub, Talmon, Ahiman, and their relatives. Shallum was the chief. He was previously stationed at the king's gate on the east side. These were the gatekeepers from the camp of the Levites. Shallum, son of Korah, son of Abiasaph, son of Korah, and his relatives from his ancestral family. The Korathites were assigned to guard the thresholds of the tents. Their ancestors had been assigned to Yahweh's camp as guardians of the entrance. In earlier times, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, had been their leader, and Yahweh was with him. Zechariah, son of Meshelemiah, was the gatekeeper at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The total number of those chosen to be gatekeepers at the thresholds was 212. They were registered by genealogy in their settlements. David and the seer Samuel had appointed them to their trusted positions. So they and their sons were assigned to guard the gates of Yahweh's temple, which had been the temple or the tent temple. I believe that'd be in reference to the tabernacle. The gatekeepers were on the four sides, east, west, north, and south. Their relatives came from their settlements at fixed times to be with them 7 days. But the four chief gatekeepers, who were the Levites, were entrusted with the rooms and the treasuries of God's temple. They spent the night in the vicinity of God's temple because they had guard duty and were in charge of opening it every morning. Some of them were in charge of the utensils used in worship. They would count them when they brought them in and when they took them out. Others were put in charge of the furnishings and all the utensils of the sanctuary, as well as the fine flour, wine, oil, incense, and spices. Some of the priest's sons mixed the spices. A Levite called Mattathiah, son of Shallum the Korahite, was entrusted with baking the bread. Some of the Kohathites' relatives were responsible for preparing the rows of the bread of the presence every Sabbath. The singers, the heads of the Levites' families, stayed in the temple chambers and were exempt from the other tasks because they were on duty day and night. These were the heads of the Levite families, chiefs, according to their family records. They lived in Jerusalem. Now shift back to Saul's family because he's going to lead into chapter 10. So basically at this point, it seems that the chronicler is going to retell Saul's family line because he's going to be mentioned at the beginning of chapter 10. But we read that in 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 35, that Jael fathered Gibeon and lived in Gibeon. His wife's name was Maacah. Abdon was his firstborn son, then Zur, Kish, Baal, Ner, Nadab, Gedor, Ahio, Zechariah, and Mikloth. Mikloth fathered Shimeam. These also lived opposite the relatives in Jerusalem with other relatives. Ner fathered Kish. Keith fathered Saul, and Saul fathered Jonathan. Malchishua, Abinadab, and Eshbaal. Jonathan's son was Merib Baal, and Merib Baal fathered Micah. Micah's sons, Bithon, Melech, Tareah, and Ahaz. Ahaz fathered Jerah, and Jerah fathered Alimeth, Azmaveth, and Zimri. Zimri fathered Moza. Moza fathered Benaiah. His son was Rephaiah. His son Elasa, and his son Azel. Azel had 6 sons, and these were their names: Azrikam, Bokaru, Ishmael, Sheariah, Obadiah, and Hanan. These were Azel's sons. And then you can look at verse number 10, where Saul then is introduced into the narrative. Because once we get into chapter 10, we get into the more easily read sections, and probably the more interesting sections to our minds, at least here within the Chronicles. We'll get into more narrative portions tomorrow in our read through chapter 10. But for today, we recognize again that this is a retelling of Benjamin's descendants, but there is certainly a different focus here. It is not a simple repetition repeating of what we saw in chapter 7, whereas what we see in chapter 9 and verses 35 through 44, the retelling of Benjamin, this is the same as chapter 8, 29 through 38. So chapter 9 or chapter 8, what we read earlier, beginning verse 29, going through the end of the chapter, that is very similar to what we have in chapter 9. That's not true, though, about what we have in chapter 8 for Benjamin's descendants and what we saw previously in chapter 9, because there's something here that's very different. And what's very different here is the emphasis on where these people lived. We see about Ehud's sons in verse 6. They were living in Geba. We see in verse 12, Elpaal's sons. They were the ones who built Ono and Lod and its surrounding villages. In verse number 28, we read about, these are the family heads, the chiefs, according to their family records. They lived in Jerusalem. So again, it is not just a reminder of the lineage that ties the post-exilic Jews to their history, but also it is where they lived. Because remember, the land was very important. Even within the law, there were those stipulations about how you don't just give land away. You don't just do that. It was very special. It was supposed to be specifically to particular families and tribes and such. So this, what we have in verses 1 through 28, again, just seems to tie the people back to historical Israel, back to the historical land. Let them know, hey, this is where you're supposed to be. Moving into chapter 9, we see something that probably familiar to us once we read what we read in the Kings. Remember how at the end of each of the description of the king's reign, that would say something to the effect of the rest of the events of King so-and-so and all of his exploits and his victories and this and that. They're recorded in the book of the kings of Israel, or in the book of the kings of Judah. Well, we have something similar here, that these genealogies, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel. So if you really want to know where they came from, you can find those there as well. So there's a historical basis again. The chronicler is not just pulling these things out of thin air, but in fact, there has been one particular thing that was mentioned that ties that in is chapter 5 and verse 17, that all of them were registered in the genealogies during the reigns of Judah's king Jotham and Israel's king Jeroboam. That talks about Gad's descendants. So the chronicler seems to have access to other historical records. Maybe they had access, maybe he or they had access to this particular book, the book of the kings of Israel, the book of the kings of Judah. Maybe they had access to that, and that's what helped them in filling in a lot of these gaps. Even though we know, I don't know if I mentioned that yet, but the genealogies here are not absolutely complete. There are some things that are missing. There are some even tribes that are missing altogether. I think Zebulun isn't mentioned at all. It's very interesting that's the case, but again, it's not just a plain retelling of history. It's not just a plain retelling of the past, but it's telling what is necessary in order to achieve a theological purpose. That theological purpose being, y'all belong here. We belong here. This is our land. This is where we were. And we would have been here. We would have stayed here. But for the fact that Judah was unfaithful and they were exiled to Babylon. See, that's why you haven't been here so long. That's why you feel disconnected from this land and from your history. It's because it got cut off in some senses. It didn't continue on in a very blessed and good way. But we're back now. And who was back first? Well, first one's back. The Israelites, specifically the priests, the Levites, the temple servants, they get to return back from captivity. And we read about some of them within the text. We read about the descendants of Judah and Benjamin, Ephraim and Manasseh. They're the ones that settled in Jerusalem. The Benjaminites were there. The priests were there. The Levites were there. They need a gatekeeper. So as I'm reading through this, I'm assuming that there is some sort of, I don't even know. Well, actually, I'll take it back. You got to think about this in terms of what's going to happen in Ezra and Nehemiah as well, with the coming back to the promised land, the rebuilding of the Jerusalem walls, the rebuilding of the temple. getting just worship back in order. Because that's the thing. They're not just coming back into the promised land, and they're not just coming back into Jerusalem just to live in the place that they were living previously. No, there's a reason, because it's in the land here where they are able to fulfill in the fullest sense everything that they were designed to fulfill, which was the worship of God. So once they're back in the land now, then they can start working or getting together worship and stuff. And that seems to be, if I'm understanding this correctly, that seems to be what's being described in chapter 9 is the return to worship, and listing those who were participating in some of the worship activities, who were the gatekeepers. The Korathites are mentioned, the Merarites are mentioned, the Levites specifically are mentioned, which it's important for them to be mentioned, and especially for the priests to be mentioned, because that shows that the genealogy or the genealogical line for the priesthood, it's still there and it's still continued, it's still intact and moving forward as it needed to be. And you have the people talking about the utensils for worship. There were some people that were in charge of that. There were some people that were staying within the facility because they were constantly doing things. What we have here is a beginning of return to normalcy for Israel. And again, they might be thinking, oh, but this isn't great. This isn't great. You remember talked I don't remember what context that this was in. I remember somebody make this comment before, but once they start rebuilding the temple and everything, you have the younger folks are just so overjoyed about the rebuilding, and some of the older folks are really sad because it just wasn't the same. Yeah, that was a reality. It wasn't the same. And for that, some of the people might feel disconnected. But here's the chronicler telling us no, or telling them, no, this is where you should be. You have a genealogical reason to be here. You are the descendants of these individuals. You have a geographical reason to be here. This is where your family was. You have a theological reason to be here. This is where God is to be worshipped. So we look at chapters 1 through 9 of Chronicles. Don't miss that. Don't miss that this is to be, in many cases, an encouraging text to influence the people to press forward and to know this is where you belong, and to remember, then moving past this, once we get back into the narrative portion, remember why you were sent away, and don't make those same mistakes again. Do what is right now so that we can remain here and be the people that God originally saved us and created us as a new family, new people to be. And certainly that's a good reminder for us too, as Christians today. But it's good to be reminded of why God saved us and his expectations for saving us, what he expects out of those who have benefited from the shed blood of his son. If you have any questions here about First Chronicles chapters 8 and 9, or anything that we've mentioned so far in the Chronicles, please feel free to leave that in the comment section below. And I hope that you'll take some time to read along with me tomorrow as we get back into the narrative portion again. Did I really do just chapter 10? No, okay, chapters 10 and 11 we'll be reading tomorrow. It's going to discuss very short and very brief detail the reign of Saul, and then start focusing more on David. So tomorrow we'll be reading chapters 10 and 11 together. Hope to see you then. Hope you have a great rest of your Thursday. May God bless you in all that you do. And I appreciate you taking some time to join me in reading God's word today. Take care and God bless.